The last time I gave a talk on the way home, I said to my wife, how'd I do in my talk? She said it was pretty good, but you missed a lot of good chances to sit down. I'll try to stick to my notes today and see if I can avoid that. First, I'd like to say I'm very honored to be on the stage with these very great people. And I'd like to share some information with you today about my experience in the Air Force, old Army Air Corps. In those days, became the Air Force, I think, 1945. And some of my experiences on missions. I was fortunate, as was my crew, to complete our tour of 35 combat missions over Europe with minor injuries to only 2 of our crew members. Now, many of the other air crews were not that fortunate. Every time you went on a mission, it was a life or death situation, an experience. We had to contend with mechanical failures of aging bombers. We had to contend with swarming enemy fires and deadly anti-aircraft fire that flak. With that in mind, let me share some statistics with you. 1 of every 5 American servicemen and women killed in World War II was a bomber crew member who flew missions over Europe in the 8th and the 15th Air Force. 1 of every 6 men and women killed in the European theater of operations were pilots and aircrew members of the 8th Air Force, of which I was a member. I'm not diminishing the sacrifices of all the other services John talked about, and so did Mickey, but the Air Force had the highest casualty rate of any of the American military forces. 28% killed in action, 23% missing in action, prisoners of war. Let me share some more statistics with you. The 303rd Heavy Bomb Group of B-17s arrived in England in August of 1942. In 11 daring daylight raids, the 330 bomb group lost 50% of their flyers and 120% of their aircraft. October 10th to the 14th of 1943, 3 days of heavy raids by the 8th Air Force. The 8th Air Force lost 100 bombers, 10 members to a crew in those days, at 1,000 airmen, 10 times the number of people in this audience today. I was a co-pilot in the 8th Air Force, the 398th Bomb Group of that Air Force. And our bomb group suffered 31% missing in action, killed in action, and prisoners of war. Not very good odds. Let me share with you a little bit about what it's like to be on an air raid, on a mission. You know, I'm 92 years old now. That was 71 years ago. So it's interesting how much I remember, how much I've forgotten, and how much maybe I don't want to remember. Let me begin by telling you that one of our pilots discovered this, that air raid spelled backwards is diarrhea. And I know a lot of airmen and crewmen who will attest to that. On our base, every night we checked the bulletin board to see if there was a mission the next day, and if your squadron and your crew was scheduled to fly. If you did, this is what we did. We tied a white towel on the end of our Army cot, which also had our name on it. 2 o'clock in the morning, an orderly comes in and flashes a light in your eyes and says, breakfast at 3, briefing at 4. So we go to breakfast at 3, and then we have the opportunity of stopping by the chaplain's office for communion and a blessing. I made that stop every day, didn't miss one of those. After breakfast, we went to the briefing room to hear about the mission, and it's a very dramatic situation. The commanding officer's up on a stage like this, pulls back that curtain. On the wall is a huge map of Europe, points out our target for the day, the yarn cloth showing us, the string showing us where we're going to go to the target and how we're going to get back home from that target. We learned lots of other things in that thing. We learned our position, that we're going to be flying in our squadron. We also learned about radio frequencies, code names, weather conditions, information about enemy fighter attacks, areas where we're going to see some anti-aircraft fire, where we're going to get our own fighter coverage and other pertinent information we need for that mission. Then after the briefing, we go back to our combat squad room to change into our combat gear. And this is what that entailed. You took off your uniform and you put on long johns. Long johns? Yeah, it's minus 35 degrees to minus 55 degrees when you're flying your missions from 24,000 feet to 30,000 feet. Deadly cold up there. That's really 67 degrees and 87 degrees below freezing, if you want to look at it that way. So we put on the electrically wired heating suit. The problem with that is they often short it out, or your plane electrical system would be shot out, no heat. Long johns, that's why you did that. Then you put on your wool socks, you put on your leather-lined, fleece-lined leather flying pants, you put on your fleece-lined leather flying boots, put on your fleece-lined leather flying jacket, and then you put on silk gloves, and then your fleece-lined leather gloves on top of that. And then you put on your fleece-lined leather flying helmet, which had your earphones attached to that. And then you put on your goggles. And then you put on your yellow Mae West life preserver, put on your parachute harness, and then you attach your oxygen mask to your helmet. That's not all. Once you got on the bomber, you put on a throat microphone, which meant you had your hand free to fly the plane or shoot those 50 caliber machines, whatever your job was on that airplane. Then we put on a flight jacket, which is a flak jacket, excuse me, which is a bulletproof vest, much like you see the SWAT teams in the 6 o'clock news when you're watching the news. Then we put on our parachute pack. We didn't have a parachute like fighter pilots do because of the situation we're in. You had a packet that attached onto your harness. But if you're flying that plane, you can't have that there, so it's down by the side of your seat, and hopefully you can grab that at the right time. Once we're in flight and we're nearing enemy territory, we ought to put on a heavy metal helmet to protect us even more. You know, by the time we have all this stuff on, we look like something that Star Wars haven't even developed yet. So 5 o'clock in the morning, they truck us out to our airplane, and the pilot, the co-pilot, go through an airplane check with the ground crew chief. He and his team have probably been up all night long repairing yesterday's damage and tuning up the engine and fueling our plane with 2,700 gallons of high-octane gas and helping the ordnance men load 4 8,000-pound bombs onto our plane, tons of bombs onto our planes, and also bring all those canisters of ammunition for the 13 positions of the 50 caliber machine guns, which made us known as the Flying Fortress. About 6 o'clock, we gathered the crew together, and we took time to go through some of the high points of that mission that we picked up at the briefing. Radio frequencies, code names, watching out for fighter planes, and so on. Very pertinent. There was also a saying, and a good rule to follow was, before each mission, to make sure your bladders are empty and your gas tanks are full. When you're flying at 28,000 feet and it's 70 degrees below zero, you know what I'm talking about. After that, we all take our positions on the plane, our flight positions on the plane, and we prepare for takeoff. About 7 a.m., we get the signal for our big bird to taxi out to the runway in a predetermined order. And then we wait for the green flare from the control tower, which means it's our turn to take off. B-17 bomber took off every 30 seconds. You can imagine the turbulence on that airway when you're trying to pull a 65,000-pound airplane up into the air. It's quite a struggle. Between 7 and 8 o'clock in the morning, we maneuver into formation, which means that we have to find our squadron leader who is flying a pre-designated colored flare, and we get alongside and get into our position with him. And then the squadron leader leads us into the bomber formation for our whole group. Now, this is going on over our radio buncher, it's called, and not too far over. The other groups were doing the same thing, so there are hundreds of airplanes in the air at the same time. It's a very, very dangerous situation. So after we've done this choreographed dance that I'm talking about, we've gone up to about 10 to 15,000 feet, so we have to put on our oxygen mask. And then all the bomber groups fall into line, almost like a parade, and they aim for a certain spot or the English coast at a set time, and we head for our target someplace in Europe for that day. We're climbing all the time till we reach something like 24,000 or 30,000 feet before we get to the enemy territory. After we've been in flight for 4 to 6 hours, depending upon where that target is, we arrive at the target area. We come to what we call the IP, which is the initial point. The initial point is before you get set, before you go into the bomb run, you have to keep your plane straight, you have to keep the altitude constant, you have to keep the airspeed constant. The reason for doing that gives the bombardier a much better chance to hit the target when he drops those bombs. But it also gives them a much better chance down there. You're a sitting duck. Same speed, same air, same altitude, you don't move, no maneuvering. So we really feel like there's a sitting duck down there for that artillery. Flying from that initial point to the target takes about 5 or 10 minutes of air time. I have to tell you, it seems like 5 to 10 hours while you're sitting there waiting for that occasion to happen. What you really wait for is to hear those magical words from the bombardier, "Bombs away," followed by, "Let's get the hell out of here." About 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, after our long flight home from the mission and still going through combat conditions, we land the big bird and immediately go into an interrogation room. And we go into great detail about what happened on that mission with the intelligence staff. While we're doing that, the Red Cross has come around serving coffee and cigarettes. I started smoking then, took me 45 years to quit. They also come by with a tray full of Scotch whiskey. You have to sign a paper that says, "This Scotch whiskey is for medicinal purposes only," which we signed readily. Then we leave the squadron room and we go back, the interrogation room, and we go back to our telephone. And then we go back to the squadron room, get out of all that combat gear that I was talking about, put on our uniforms, and then if you have an appetite, it's about 6 o'clock and you head for the mess hall. You know, we haven't eaten since 3 o'clock in the morning, so it's been a long, long day. So missions usually take somewhere between 6 to 10 hours, depending on the length of the target where we're going. But you know, when you're 21 years old and you're flying these missions, it's exhilarating, it's frightening, and it's exciting, and that adrenaline is really flowing. So when you're 21 years old, you know that you're invincible, you know that you're immortal, and you know that you're indestructible. But if you're smart enough, you know that you can be plenty scared. So I thank you for the time. I'll pay attention to my wife's admonition and take a chance to sit down. But let me tell you that I appreciate the chance to talk to you about the old Air Corps and some of my experiences there. Before I close, I'd like to share a poem with you. The poem was written by Kevin Whitaker from Macclesfield, England. He's a member of our 8th Air Force Historical Society, and he submitted this poem for one of our quarterly publications. Imagine you're at a Veterans Day parade. The title of the poem is, "Why Do You Still March, Old Man?" Why do you still march, old man, with medals on your chest? Why do you still weep, old man, for comrades laid to rest? And why do you still grieve, old man, for a war of long ago? You seek answers from me, young man? It's by God's good grace I am old. We were once like you, young man, in youth, yes, quite bold. And in our youth we heard those notes of the battle's bugle call. They pinned silver wings on our chests and hoped we would not fall. Yes, we buried some in blanket shroud, a young flesh scorched and black, a communal grave newly dug with gorged with blood-stained earth and bracken. I'll tell you why I march, young man. I march with my medals on my chest. I think of days when we were in the air and flying over those missions in fiery skies. And so you ask me why I march, young man. I march to remind you all, but for those brave and fallen youths, you would never have known freedom at all.